Well, good morning, Formation Church. It is a pleasure to be with you. And I was here, I can't remember how long ago it was. I'm not very good at remembering dates, but was here when the men were at a retreat. A lot of the men were. So I made it back, and I'm glad that you wanted me to come back. That says something, and I'm really glad to be with you this morning. This morning's presentation is going to be a little different than an expository message through a passage. What Dan has asked me to share is a little bit of the background and story and the purpose and everything going on at Colossians and at the city of Colossae. So I want to share a little bit very visually this morning. I've got a lot of slides. And so grab your popcorn and your Diet Cokes and whatever else you've got, and we will look at this together this morning, if the technology works, and I think it will. Let me get this going. Don't look at the password. So I'm going to call this morning Colossians Comes Alive, and we'll be looking at a few different passages as we go through it this morning. And as we get started, I just want to say a little bit, so you know a little bit more about my background. Dan rightly remembered I'm from Shafter, California, but I actually lived about 10 miles out of Shafter, maybe 11 miles out of Shafter. Actually closer to a big thriving metropolis called Buttonwillow, California. But almost equidistant, Shafter, Wasco, Buttonwillow is where I was raised. So after the service, if you have any questions at all about how to grow cotton, I am an expert at that, as well as alfalfa as well. But it was in that community where I became a Christian. My family moved there. My dad started working in agriculture. None of us, I'd never gone to church. I went to church one time in my life before I was a teenager. And so we moved into this community. We were surrounded by Christians. They were Mennonites. Now, we didn't know the difference between a Mennonite and a Midianite. And we knew that these people in this community were just really kind to us, really loving toward us. In fact, my parents were blown away by it. They'd never experienced that before. And we started going, they invited us, and we started going to this little country church that was Mennonite Brethren. Shafter, as big as it was, 5,000 people at the time, had 3 Mennonite Brethren churches. We went to one out in the country, and about 80 people. And it was there that the gospel was explained to us. I had the privilege of seeing my mother and stepfather come to know Christ, and then a couple weeks later, the pastor cornered me and explained the gospel to me, and I became a Christian. That pastor was a graduate of Biola College. Well, actually, at the time that he went, it was the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, down on 6th and Hope. He graduated in 1927. He had a lot of stories that I wish I had recordings to hear his stories of sharing the gospel out on the streets of L.A. at the time, but had spent his life as a missionary and then came back and was a part-time pastor of this little country church. And he told me, he said, you know, now that you know Christ, you need to get into this book. And he gave me a Bible reading plan, and I started reading this book. And I have to admit, I didn't know anything when I first started this. I didn't know what the word salvation meant. I'd heard of the Salvation Army, but at Christmas time, but that was it. Redemption, all these terms, I didn't know anything. And I just began immersing myself in Scripture, and there's been no turning back. I've just craved learning more and more and more about God's plan, about His design, about His love for us. And I'm so grateful for the Word of God and the way it shapes us and forms us and helps us in our growth. So I want to share with you a little bit about that this morning. And part of this is the recognition, too. I knew a lot about growing cotton, and so did the Colossians, because that's cotton growing area. And so the times we've gone to Colossae, I felt right at home. The difference, I think, instead of John Deere caps, they have turbans on their heads when they're driving their tractors. But it felt right at home, felt like I was back home in Shafter, although it's a little prettier there actually than it is in Shafter. But there was a bit of a connection there that way. So we'll begin our little jaunt through some of the background, and I'll hopefully make some of this come alive for you. Is there a way to dim these lights? I don't know. If this first bank of lights could go down, that would be great. So just some perspective on where Colossae is located. If you look at I ripped it off straight from the ESV Study Bible here, but I'm giving him credit this morning. This is a great little map of the Mediterranean world, and you see in this map the city of Ephesus right here. And if you go to Ephesus and turn right and go 110 miles inland, there's Colossae. Colossae is in an area that's a rich, fertile agricultural area, but right on the verge of some major mountain peaks and so on there. There's 3 cities that form a triangle of cities in that area. One is Colossae, one is Laodicea, and the other is Hierapolis. All 3 are mentioned in the Bible, and of course, you know from the book of Revelation, Laodicea was one of the 7 churches in that area. Here's a little bit more of a detailed map of that area. You see Laodicea featuring very largely on this map, and then Hierapolis just north or above it, and then Colossae down in the bottom section down here. You can see it there. So those 3 cities, very significant cities. Now what I'll say is this: by the time we get to the era when the Apostle Paul was writing his letter to the Colossians, Laodicea was the big city in the area. Colossae was regarded as just a little country town. Hierapolis was much, much bigger than Colossae. So Colossae was the meager one. Laodicea was the big city. That's like Shafter in relationship to Bakersfield. Bakersfield was kind of the suburb of Shafter. I'm just kidding on that. But by the way, I don't know if you guys knew it, but Bakersfield had a contest years ago I think it was when I was in high school. They had a contest they felt like, hey, every city has a motto and we don't have a motto. And so they ran this contest and they got all these entries about what our motto could be. And I remember reading it in the Bakersfield Californian, and there was one I really liked, but it didn't win. But the one I really liked for Bakersfield was Bakersfield, a place where lizards crawl to die. I just thought that kind of captures it. That captures the way a lot of people feel about Bakersfield. But I'm from Shafter. And our motto is agricultural paradise of the world. But I feel like I'm at home in this area when we go there. Colossae, however, was the oldest city in that region of those 3 cities. Laodicea and Hierapolis got started in the 2nd century BC. Colossae, they have found that the roots of it go back as early as the Persian era. Now, we're talking about the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and Nebuchadnezzar and all of that time period. And there's evidence that it existed as a city then. And actually even before then, into the Hittite era, which is the time of Abraham. And even before that, into an era that we can call Neo-Chalcolithic era, which is way before the time of Abraham. We're talking 3000 BC. This is a very ancient city, and so any work that they do there, you could find things potentially from many, many different eras of history. So I put this picture in there because in 1985, 40 years ago, I was studying in Aberdeen, Scotland, where I did my doctoral work, and I felt at times like we were 5 miles off the Arctic Circle living in Aberdeen because it was so cold and so wet. But we had the opportunity one year to go to Turkey and visit some of the biblical sites. And I wanted to see Colossae because part of my doctoral work was on the background of Paul's letter to the Colossians. And I wanted to see it. The only problem is none of the maps showed where it was at. It had never been excavated. No tourists were going out there at that point in time. And so we rented a car in Izmir, Turkey, and drove out to that area after visiting Ephesus and a variety of other cities. And we looked and we looked and we looked, and all I had was archaeological reports about the city. And we couldn't find it. There was no road that went to it. And so I felt a little weird taking my rental car out on dirt roads and things like that, beating around. We stopped at a local kebab stand just off the road. We could eat our way through Turkey, by the way. It's such good food. And as we were eating our lunch there and kind of down because we couldn't find Colossae, a couple of Turkish men came over to our table and said, what are you guys doing here? At the time, they'd never seen Americans coming into the area and wondered what we were looking for, what we were doing. And I explained that we were looking to find the city of Colossae, an ancient city. They had never heard of it. And then they decided, we want to help you find it. Now, it was a bit of a challenge communicating with them because I didn't know Turkish, they didn't know English. They knew German, and I knew a little German. And so we were communicating in broken German during this time. But they insisted, we're going to help you find Colossae. And come on over and jump in the back of our car. And I thought, I don't know about that. In the interior of Turkey and Barbara was pregnant with our firstborn at the time, getting into a car and just cruising, I don't know. But they insisted, we finally jumped in. And you see the car there, a 64 Chevy Impala, and we got into the back of the car, and there were these cars all around. I don't know what it was with these old Chevy Impalas and where they got them or anything. But we got into the car, and I remember sitting there thinking, what have I done? Because on the mirror was this dangling little skeleton. But Shevki, the driver of the car, the guy in the middle in this picture, Shevki with his Chevy, took off and we started looking for this tell. The other guy, an older gentleman, had been a taxi driver in Germany for most of his life. But they were just so kind and wanted to show us. They talked to farmers, they did all this stuff to try to find this place, and they found it. We found the site of Colossae. And the municipality had just graded this dirt road by the site, which was unfortunate because you could see bits and pieces of the building material of the ancient city just partly destroyed because of that. But it was part of some water project. So we found Colossae 40 years ago, the site. The site had been positively identified and everything. And that was our first experience. Since then, we've been back many, many times to the city of Colossae in Ephesus and have been watching what develops there. This is the site. As you can see, there's this mound that's there. And the mound is the Acropolis of the city. It's all been covered by dirt over hundreds and hundreds of years. And so all the building materials, the principal building materials of the city are buried underneath that area. Now, having grown up on a farm, I know how to use a shovel. And I was so tempted, but I never did over there. I didn't want to spend my time in a Turkish jail for doing that sort of thing. Another picture of the site. You see in the background a huge mountain peak, Mount Cadmus, 8,800 feet, but a source for the water supply for that area with just pure mountain water that came down there. In the foreground, a lot of grain that's growing. So it's very agricultural, but the whole site is open and available, never excavated. Another picture of it. In the foreground, you see grapes that are being grown. But this mound is about 220 feet high at the highest point. and covers a span of about 25 acres. So it's not a huge site. It's much more compact. Of course, the city would have spread out beyond that. This would have been the city center, but it is just laying there open. If you go to other sites today, like Thessaloniki in Greece, it's all modern city. It's all covered over. And so there's no opportunity for excavation and archaeological work in those areas. Here's an aerial picture of the site of Colossae that you can see, and now a paved road that runs by the side of it there as well. On the left side is a rounded feature that you can see just barely, and that would have been the theater of Colossae. So this is standing on top of the mound, and so it gives a little bit of perspective as to the height of this Acropolis city. And across the way, just in the background, you see an orchard in there, and I'll come back to that one in a moment. Right here. Because as is typical for farmers where there's stone and things in the fields, they gather their stones and they take them and build stone walls. And in this orchard, you find a stone wall. The only trouble is when you look really closely, you find that much of the stone is cut stone. So parts of the building materials from the site have gone in the construction of that wall, which would be one of the first places I would excavate if I were excavating in that city. Now, many groups have sought permission to excavate the site of Colossae over the years because, like me, they go there and they see how open it is and how it would be easy to excavate this. The Turkish government has always denied permission to these groups for permission to excavate the site. I remember in the 70s, there was a group called the Near East Archaeological Society, affiliated with the Evangelical Theological Society, that repeatedly petitioned Turkish government, always denied. More recently, there was a group from Australia that did, always denied. So it has never been excavated until now. Until now. Beginning in July of this year, just a few months ago, the site of Colossae has begun to be excavated. And the Turkish government has granted official permission to a group of archaeologists from Pamukkale University, which is very close by, to begin excavation of the site at Colossae. Now, it's not at all surprising because the Turkish government has been very anxious to promote tourism in the city, and they call it faith tourism. And all of a sudden, they've realized the potential for tourism. And Turkey has often been in competition with Greece for tourism dollars. So that's a part of it. But there's also a phenomenal archaeological department at this place called Pamukkale University, close by. The chair of the Department of Archaeology at Pamukkale University has been the chief excavator of the site of Laodicea. And Laodicea has been the object of excavation for the last 20 years. When we went there in 1985, Laodicea had never been excavated. Now, massive portions of Laodicea have been excavated. They found the main thoroughfare through there. They found two theaters, a stadium, many, many public buildings. And get this, they have found upwards of 20 remains of 20 different churches in Laodicea. Now, most of those date from late Roman to early Byzantine era. They post-date the New Testament, but it shows how Christianity took root and grew in that region. They've also excavated at Laodicea a church right in the middle of the city that was a big edifice and has been positively identified as the council church. And it refers to a council that took place at Laodicea in the year 350. And you see a huge baptistry there in front of it. It's just beautiful and ornate and just incredible thing that's happened there. But excavation began at Colossae in July and is continuing as we talk. The chief excavator of Colossae is this man named Barış Yener. He comes from the east side of Turkey. and a city called Gaziantep. And if you may remember, there was a very bad earthquake that hit there a few years ago. And Barish told me that he lost a number of family members in that earthquake that hit Gaziantep on the eastern side. But he's a professor at Pamukkale University, and he's been named as the chief archaeologist. He was also a student under this older professor that has been excavating Laodicea, so he's been deeply involved in the excavation of Laodicea as well. There we are. I don't know who that weird guy is in the middle, but at any rate, we're standing on top of the site of Colossae. At the time, he had been doing preliminary work before he got permission to excavate the site with ground-penetrating radar, trying to make a determination as to where they would begin excavation if the Turkish government eventually granted permission. And so they know exactly what they're going to do because of what they've been able to see and determine from that. Now, October 23rd, that's just a couple weeks ago, Fox News covered the excavation of Colossae, and you can still find this on the web. Fox News ran an article, "Archaeologists Uncover Vast Complex of Ancient Tombs in the Biblical City Tied to St. Paul's Letter." That's the letter that you guys are looking at right now, Paul's letter to the Colossians. Now, I'd been in communication with Professor Yaner a lot. I knew where they were excavating, and he had told me that they had found a number of tombs in this area. Most of them had been raided, so anything gold, silver, valuable had already been stolen from that area. But these tombs date what we would say late Hellenistic, early Roman era. They're cut into bedrock. This bedrock area was made out of travertine stone, and the Romans and the Greeks cut tombs into this area, and then they would cover it with a big slab of rock, and then sometimes put a pediment on top of it, a monument for the person who had died, and sometimes there were inscriptions on these that you could read and learn a little bit more. Now, most of the covering was still there, and so they uncovered this vast area, looked into the tombs, and they found 60 tombs in this area. And in those tombs, they weren't empty. They found a variety of different things inside the ancient tombs, and I'll explain that in a moment here. Here is kind of the honeycomb area. You can see there, all the dirt was brushed aside. There it just looked like a field, but underneath that was this travertine bedrock, and you can see how they cut the tombs into those areas. And so they found 60 of these in that area. Here you can see a picture of them actually cleaning some of them out and looking very carefully at what was inside those tombs. And another picture from above where you can see them excavating in the tombs. Now, what did they find in those tombs? Archaeologists found terracotta ceramics, they found glass bottles, they found oil lamps, coins, sandals, personal belongings of the deceased. Now, how this can help us is it can give us a little bit of a window and picture into daily life and the kinds of things they were using and living with in daily life. The lamps, someone has interpreted that to mean that they may have been buried with the lamps in the graves because the lamps were thought to illuminate the journey into the afterlife. We don't know, but for sure what those lamps were, but there wasn't a great hope that people had living in the Greek and Roman world about life after death. Homer's works and Hesiod's works were significant in informing that, and it was this gloomy existence where they would go into the underworld and be led across the river Styx and enter into the underworld, and it was a shadowy, gloomy, joyless existence. That was the hope of people living in the ancient world. Can you imagine the contrast with what the gospel brings and the hope that we have of being with Christ? So what I'd like to do in the next few moments is just talk for a few moments about three different things that Colossians does. And you've covered some of this territory already. And I want to make three separate points about what this historical context, how it can help illuminate the text of Colossians and maybe help make it come more alive. And so I'm going to begin with this point as my first point, and that is, number one, Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth. Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth. You're memorizing Colossians 1:15 through 16 at least, maybe more. That is an amazing passage because of the incredible things it says about Jesus Christ. We don't need to excavate Colossae to know that Jesus is Lord, right? We know Jesus is Lord, and we can proclaim him as such. But what did it mean to people back then who came from a background of other worship, of other deities, and embraced the one living and true God? What does this mean that Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth? And that's where I think it can give us just a little bit more color for interpreting the letter to the Colossians. So we got to remember that 2,000 years ago, there was no scientific naturalism. Everybody believed in gods and goddesses, spirits, good and evil spirits, and all these sorts of things. And they lived in light of that. And so for the folks at Colossae, they worshipped a variety of deities. We know that in that era, people were polytheistic. That means they worshiped multiple gods. And so they were accustomed to worshiping the gods who claimed to benefit them in some way, the gods that claimed to be powerful. Now, there were rival claims to supremacy by the deities in the first century world. In other words, Jesus isn't the only one to come across and say, and the people worship him as Lord of heaven and earth. This was the principal deity that people worshipped as Lord of heaven and earth, and his name was Zeus. And he existed in multiple local manifestations of Zeus. In other words, he had a hyphenated name associated with a particular location. But Zeus was the head of the Greek pantheon. He was worshipped in Colossae as well. And we know a little bit already, even though the full site hasn't been excavated, because we found many coins that were discovered in a variety of places that were minted at Colossae, and they often depicted what gods and goddesses were being worshipped. Zeus was one. Another one that was worshipped in that city was the Ephesian Artemis. We know about her from Acts chapter 19, and you remember in that incident, the big mob scene in the theater at Ephesus, and they chanted for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." But she was worshipped far beyond Ephesus. She was worshipped as one of the primary deities in Colossae, 110 miles inland. Now here is a picture of the Ephesian Artemis. Not the typical Greek Artemis that you find in smooth flowing robes, but this is a very much an Asia Minor deity that has taken the name of Artemis because she shares many of the same characteristics of Artemis. I'll zoom in on a couple of those features. If you looked really closely at her necklace, what you could make out is there's a crab, there's goat-like things, and there's a variety of different images that maybe you can detect what they are. They are the signs of the zodiac. There's the Cancer, the crab, the Sagittarius, and on, all the signs of the zodiac. She wore them as a necklace. Do you know why? Because she was Queen of Heaven. She was the God of heaven. And she had power over all the spirits that populated the heavens, the astral spirits and everything that populated the heavens. If you worshiped Artemis, you're worshiping a cosmic deity that had power over the heavens. Now that's in rivalry with Zeus, but nevertheless, she was worshipped that way. These little guys were all over her cultic skirt. Okay, I grew up on a farm. That doesn't look like anything we had on a farm. These guys are scary-looking little creatures. They look a little bit like goats with their horns, but you can see they're in a posture of surrender, pinned up to the deity. And the most likely explanation for these symbols on the cultic skirt of Artemis is that they represent spirits of wildlife and nature. Once again, we're going back 2,000 years. People believed in a world populated by spirits and that they needed to be protected from evil things that could come as a result of spiritual influences. If you worship Artemis, she's worshipped as a goddess that has power over terrestrial spirits, but she's also worshipped as a goddess who has power over underworld spirits. Here's another one that was worshipped, we know, from the coins at Colossae. His name is Main, moon god Main. Often depicted with these horns coming out of his shoulder. Lunar symbols, actually. This inscription on one of the inscriptions from the moon god Main says this: there is one God in the heavens, the great heavenly Main, great power of the immortal God. Now, if you left the worship of Artemis, or the worship of Main, or the worship of Zeus, and you put your faith and said the sinner's prayer and put your faith in Jesus Christ, what about the rest of the gods I used to worship? What do I do with that? This would have been in the back of the minds of the Colossians, for sure. Another deity widely worshipped all through that valley, all through Asia Minor, is this deity called Cybele. Cybele was the great mother goddess of Asia Minor. And here she is sitting on her throne. I took this photograph at the Getty Villa. Have any of you been to the Getty Villa? It's an amazing place for seeing lots of Greco-Roman antiquities. And Cybele is there, but she was widely worshipped there. But she was the mother of the gods, which gave her a claim to superiority. So we have these, and there's more I could mention because it was very polytheistic. But when people came to Christ and entered the church, how do I think about these gods? Where does Jesus fit in with these other gods? And then we read Colossians 1:15-20, and there's some answers to the questions they would have had. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created. Everything was created in heaven, on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he's before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he's the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. In everything he might be preeminent. And ultimately, Colossians 1:20 says that he will bring peace by reconciling everything to himself. He is supreme. You no longer need to worship Artemis. You no longer need to worship Cybele, Zeus, or any of these other deities. There is a claim on the lives of the Colossians, an exclusive claim on the lives of the Colossians. You'll worship the one living and true God through Jesus Christ. And he is preeminent and holds everything together. He is sovereign over heaven and earth. What a tremendous encouragement it would have been to them to know that. But he's preeminent over everything on earth. And Roman imperial power was something that they had to be concerned about at Colossae. The Romans had come in after Alexander the Great had come in and taken over that whole area. The Romans came in. They were the dominant power by the time we get to the first century. And they brought peace. And so their slogan was the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And Caesar Augustus brings the peace of Rome. And there's a lot of things associated with that. And in a nearby city called Aphrodisias, there was a huge, huge temple that was made in the 1st century honoring Roman power. It was called the Sebastion. Bits and pieces of it remain today, and I'm going to show you a few pictures of that because it explains the nature of Roman power. In a number of images that would have been in this Roman edifice extolling the power and might of Rome were images like this. Here's a picture of Caesar Augustus. And now this is 1st century. This would have been in existence at the time Paul wrote his letter. But a picture of Caesar Augustus with Nike, the goddess of victory, and you see this little guy between them. All of the enemies of Rome are depicted as diminutive figures. And the Roman rulers are depicted as incredibly strong and body sculpted and everything like that. And here you see Caesar Augustus. You see a guy being trampled down in between them as well, but demonstrating Roman might. Here's a picture of Claudius. He was the emperor when Colossians was written. Well, just before Colossians was written, Nero was emperor during the time Colossians was written. But here is Claudius with captives. And one other that I would put up here is Claudius depicted in his victory over Britain. Now, Julius Caesar had penetrated the British Isles much earlier, 1st century BC, but Claudius is the one that formalized Roman victory over the British Isles at that time. Now, get this, we lived in Aberdeen, Scotland, which is all the way, like I said, up, it felt like the Arctic Circle, but all the way to the northeast. And we lived in a 3rd-story apartment building, and we could look out our window and see the remains of a Roman military camp, all the way that far north in Scotland. Roman rule was amazing at that time. They were the dominant world powers. Now think of the claim that is made in Colossians 1:15-20. Everything in heaven and on earth, Jesus is sovereign. Jesus is Lord. Everything on earth. That would have been an affront to the Roman government. That would have created potentially some problems for Paul in this way. But what an encouragement to the people that the Lord we worship is Lord of heaven and earth, everything, universally in this. A second point that I would make here is that Jesus empowers us for spiritual warfare. Jesus empowers us for spiritual warfare. Colossians has a lot to say about the demonic realm and about spiritual warfare. Multiple references to powers. We find that in the Colossians 1:15-20, everything in heaven on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all language there of demonic powers. Colossians 2:8 speaks of the elementary spirits, and I take that to be a reference to demonic spirits, elementary spirits of the world that were inspiring the false teaching. Colossians 2:15 tells us about Jesus' unbelievable victory over the realm of the demonic through his death on the cross, where it says that he stripped them of their power and authority. He publicly exposed them, and he led them in a triumphal procession. And then Colossians 2:20 tells us, you have died to the influence of these spirits. There's a big theme going on in Colossians, and why is that the case? Well, in part, it's the case because they needed to hear that. They needed to know that Jesus was supreme over this realm because they were dealing with it in their daily lives. One of the things they feared was the fear of curses. And when we talk about curses in a first century context, it's not cussing. It's someone summoning spirits to go cause harm to someone. They feared that in their daily lives. And so they needed ways to protect themselves. And so they found that they could protect themselves through wearing magical amulets, and there would be people in the community that knew a lot about the way spirits operate, and they could go visit these people that had this kind of supernatural wisdom. Sometimes they're called medicine men, sometimes they're called village healers, and this sort of thing. Modern anthropologists would refer to it as a shaman figure. And they could consult with these people and get help. So look at this. In the Fox News article that came out a couple weeks ago, the excavator, Boris Yaner, said he uncovered numerous charms, amulets, and stones that were thought to possess healing qualities. The findings reveal how much the people of Colossae valued magic, talismans, and objects believed to have protective powers. Now here's an example of a curse. This is a curse was normally done through a ritual and formula, and often written on lead, and then rolled up, pierced with a nail, and deposited in a tomb or in a well. Now, we haven't found any of these curse tablets yet at Colossae. It's yet to be excavated. This is an example of what it might look like. But it would summon underworld spirits to go and cause someone harm. And so people at Colossae would have had to consider, okay, what can Jesus do to protect me from this realm? I mean, I'm a member of the community now. I'm a member of Christ's body. Can Christ protect me from this kind of stuff? They also had to fear this god that was worshipped at Colossae called Hecate. She was the goddess of witchcraft and sorcery. And just across the way in Hierapolis, you can find Hades, the god of the underworld. And at Hierapolis, there was thought to be an opening into the underworld called a plutonium, and archaeologists recently uncovered this in Hierapolis. We knew about it from ancient literature, but they've actually found it now. So there was a vibrant belief in spirits, and the issue for the Colossians was, what do I do? What does Christ do? How does he protect me from this? And so as you read and continue through Colossians, keep that in the back of your mind. I think it helps make some of the letter come more alive. Now finally, Jesus calls us to discern and resist dangerous teachings. I wish I had more time to get into this in great detail, but there's this thing called the Colossian heresy. It's often referred to as the Colossian heresy, with a lot of strange things associated with it, different religious practices, different ideas associated with it, including a couple of really strange things, visionary experience and the worship of angels. And I'm just going to say a word about the worship of angels, and then we'll draw this to a conclusion. What does it mean in Colossians 2:18 that there was a false teaching that emerged in the church where people were practicing the worship of angels? What I can say it doesn't mean is this. I don't think it means that they grabbed their guitars and they went off on Sunday evenings and they sat there worshiping the angels and singing hymns of praise to them. It's a different word for worship, having more to do with ritual and so on. And so in nearby Hierapolis, they found this piece of silver rolled up and deposited in a tomb. And it says this, I adjure you by God who founded the earth and the heavens, I adjure you by the angels, cherubim, the harmony above, Michael, Raphael, and then a pagan deity, Abrasax, to be averted from injury. What I'm going to suggest with Colossians 2:18, when it says they were advocating the worship of angels, it's not worshiping them, bowing down and worshiping them. It's invoking them. It's calling on angels for help and protection against the demonic realm. There are numerous inscriptions from this area that illustrate that practice. Amulets, like we just talked about, that they found in the graves. Now, this isn't one that was found at Colossae. This is found elsewhere. But in the top right corner, it invokes angels: Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, Uriel. And then it has all this other pagan symbolism mixed in with it from other religions. And it's this whole notion of trying to find mechanisms for protection. Now, this kind of thing would have been, kept it in their pocket or worn it as a necklace or something, but behind it is invoking angels for protection. And it's important to remember that angels weren't the unique domain of Christians or Jews. Zeus had angels who served him. It simply means a messenger spirit that would serve them. In Miletus, there's a theater at Miletus that has this inscription on the wall of the theater, which is a civic inscription for everyone to see, that invokes angels for the protection of the city, even. And so we find that there as well. The bottom inscription says, "Archangels, protect the city of the Milesians and all of its inhabitants." So as you read Colossians 2:18, that's my take on what is going on with that. Paul, when he talks to the Colossians, he says, the problem is that this false teaching is neglecting Christ. So Colossians 2:19 says the problem is they're not holding on tight to Christ, from whom the whole body receives its nourishment, its health, its direction, its support through every joint and ligaments as God supplies the body through the various members. Not holding on tight to Christ. So we can have the worship team come on up and we'll bring this to a conclusion. But the key thing here, as we bring this to a close today, is Jesus is supreme. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth. And Colossians 2:9 and 10, commit that one to memory. It says, all the fullness of the deity lives in him in bodily form. Great, we worship and honor you, Christ, but you have been filled in him, who is the head over every rule and authority. All the resources we need for living the Christian life, for dealing with sin, for dealing with the demonic, everything is found in the person of Christ. We don't need to excavate Colossae to know that truth. Hold on tight to Jesus.